Ingrid Wallstrom was the heart of Sunsolved, a librarian known for her kindness and love for the community. Eric, her devoted fiancé, was planning their future together. But when Ingrid's lifeless body was found buried in a forest, and Carl Nilsson, a man with a violent past, became the prime suspect, everything unraveled. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered chilling connections to a string of murders and a quiet man named Lars Svensson, hiding in plain sight. This is the story of a crime that shook Sweden to its core. Ingrid Wallstrom was everything you'd expect from someone beloved by a small, close-knit town. At 28 years old, she had a magnetic presence that made people gravitate toward her. Whether she was organizing book clubs at the Sundsvall Library or helping elderly neighbors with groceries, Ingrid had a way of brightening everyone's day. That's why, when she didn't come home one evening, the worry set in almost immediately. Her fiancé, Eric, was the first to notice something was wrong. Ingrid was always punctual. She'd text if she was running even a few minutes late. That evening, Eric had cooked dinner, expecting her to walk through the door at her usual time. When an hour passed with no word, he called her phone. No answer. Several more attempts yielded the same result. Eric began reaching out to her friends, co-workers, and even nearby hospitals, but no one had seen or heard from Ingrid. The next morning, after an anxious, sleepless night, Eric reported her missing to the local police. The news spread like wildfire through Sundsvall. Ingrid's disappearance wasn't something people could ignore. She was a familiar face, someone they saw every day. Within hours, posters of Ingrid with her warm smile and golden hair lined the streets and shop windows. Social media quickly picked up her story, and Find Ingrid trended nationwide. The last known sighting of Ingrid was chilling in its simplicity. A few of her colleagues recalled seeing her leave the library on her bike around 5:30 p.m. She waved to them and pedaled toward the forest trail she usually took home. Beyond that point, no one could account for where she went. Search teams mobilized immediately. Police officers, search and rescue dogs, and dozens of volunteers combed through the forest and surrounding areas. They searched tirelessly, trudging through mud and underbrush in hopes of finding even the smallest clue. Days turned into a week, and still, Ingrid remained missing. Her bright blue bicycle was eventually found abandoned on a narrow dirt path leading deeper into the woods. This discovery provided no comfort, it only deepened the fear that something terrible had happened. As hope dwindled, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that Ingrid might have run away, unable to handle the pressures of her seemingly perfect life. Others suspected foul play. Eric, though visibly shaken and desperate, faced quiet accusations from those who believed he might know more than he let on. Small towns thrive on gossip, and speculation spread like wildfire, stoked by fear and a lack of answers. Police continued their investigation, interviewing everyone close to Ingrid, piecing together her last known moments. Friends and co-workers described her as happy and without any obvious enemies. Eric vehemently defended his innocence, pointing out their plans for a wedding and their shared excitement for the future. Despite their efforts, the investigation hit a wall. Days stretched into 2 agonizing weeks without any breakthroughs. But then, when the town had almost resigned itself to uncertainty, a jogger made a grim discovery deep in the forest that no one could have anticipated. The discovery of Ingrid Wallstrom's body shattered what little hope remained in the town of Sundsvall. Deep in the forest, hidden beneath a shallow layer of dirt and leaves, a jogger found her remains 2 weeks after she disappeared. The scene was haunting, a reminder of a life cut tragically short and the cruel violence behind it. The forensic team worked methodically, combing through the site for any evidence that might lead them to her killer. Initial findings painted a grim picture. Ingrid had been strangled, and there were signs that she may have been moved post-mortem. Her clothes bore traces of an unidentified substance, a peculiar, powdery residue that puzzled investigators. There were no obvious personal belongings near her body. Her phone, bag, and other items remained missing, adding to the mystery of how she ended up in such an isolated location. The discovery thrust the investigation into overdrive. Detectives began re-interviewing those closest to Ingrid, determined to find answers. Eric, her fiancé, found himself at the center of scrutiny. It's an unfortunate reality in such cases, the partner is often the first suspect. While Eric had reported Ingrid missing and participated actively in the search efforts, the police couldn't ignore the statistics. They questioned him repeatedly, probing his alibi and scrutinizing his emotions. Eric maintained his innocence. On the night of Ingrid's disappearance, he had been at a dinner party with friends. Multiple attendees confirmed his presence, and security footage from the apartment building showed him arriving and leaving as he claimed. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, investigators began to look elsewhere. Attention shifted to Ingrid's co-workers at the library. Could someone she worked with have harbored resentment or a grudge? Her colleagues described her as kind-hearted and hardworking, with no history of conflicts. Still, the police combed through their statements, looking for inconsistencies. They also turned their gaze to Ingrid's friends, particularly those she had grown distant from in recent months. While nothing pointed to a specific individual, one unsettling fact emerged: Ingrid had been receiving threatening letters in the months leading up to her death. The letters, handwritten and signed with the initials KN, were vague but menacing. One warned her to stay away and mention what happens in the woods, and others simply read, "I'm watching you." Ingrid had dismissed them as an elaborate prank, never reporting them to the authorities. Now, those letters became a focal point of the investigation. Handwriting analysts began working to match the script to any known suspects, while forensic teams searched the letters for DNA or other trace evidence. Then, a breakthrough: a sharp-eyed officer reviewing hours of CCTV footage spotted something suspicious. From a gas station near the trail where Ingrid's bike was found, cameras had captured a figure wearing a distinctive jacket on the night she disappeared. Their face wasn't visible, but the jacket bore a patch belonging to a local hiking club, one that had disbanded years earlier. It was a critical lead, one that investigators hoped would finally begin to unravel the mystery of Ingrid's murder. The revelation of the jacket patch shifted the investigation into high gear. Identifying the hiking club associated with the patch was a straightforward task for investigators, but the real challenge was tracking down its former members. The club had been small, with only about a dozen people who met regularly for treks through the forests of Sundsvall and beyond. Over time, the group had disbanded as members moved away, lost interest, or simply drifted apart. Among the list of former members, one name immediately stood out: Carl Nilsson. Carl was a middle-aged man with a history of aggressive behavior. Years earlier, he had been convicted of assault after a violent altercation with a neighbor over a property dispute. More alarmingly, that neighbor had been Ingrid Wallstrom's family. Digging deeper, police uncovered a bitter feud that had unfolded years earlier. Carl had wanted to purchase a small piece of land adjacent to Ingrid's childhood home. When Ingrid's family refused to sell, tensions escalated, culminating in threats and eventual physical violence. Though Carl had served time and paid restitution, the bad blood between him and Ingrid's family was far from forgotten. The evidence seemed compelling. Carl owned a jacket matching the description seen in the footage, and his past made him a plausible suspect. Police brought him in for questioning, searching his home and property for anything that could tie him to Ingrid's murder. They seized items for forensic examination, including Carl's hiking gear, notebooks, and several knives. Despite the pressure, Carl vehemently denied any involvement in Ingrid's death. He claimed he had no reason to harm her and hadn't seen her in years. His alibi was shaky at first. He claimed to have been at home watching television on the night Ingrid disappeared. But no one could confirm this. Police continued to press him, confident they were closing in on their suspect. As investigators waited for forensic results from Carl's belongings, another lead emerged. The residue found on Ingrid's clothes had been partially identified as a rare industrial compound used primarily in certain niche manufacturing processes. There was no clear connection between this discovery and Carl, but it opened the door to a more complicated possibility: what if Carl had been framed? In parallel, police also revisited the threatening letters Ingrid had received. Handwriting analysis ruled out Carl as the author, and the DNA evidence retrieved from the envelopes didn't match his profile. The initial certainty around Carl as a suspect began to waver. The case took an even darker turn when a forensic specialist made a startling discovery. The chemical residue found on Ingrid's clothes matched samples from 2 unsolved murders of young women in nearby regions. Both victims had been found in similarly remote areas, killed in ways that bore unsettling similarities to Ingrid's case. This new information widened the scope of the investigation dramatically. The police were no longer chasing a single murder suspect. They now faced the chilling reality that a serial killer might be operating in the shadows, evading capture for years. The connection to the 2 earlier murders sent shockwaves through the investigation. Both cases, previously cold, shared eerie similarities with Ingrid Wallstrom's death. The victims, young women in their 20s, were found in secluded areas with no personal belongings and the same strange residue on their clothing. Even the patterns of the threatening letters were similar, cryptic, handwritten messages delivered in the months leading up to their disappearances. Until now, no link had been established between the cases, but Ingrid's death brought it all into focus. Investigators began to piece together the puzzle, creating a timeline of events and looking for patterns in the victims' lives. The earlier murders had taken place years apart, in towns separated by considerable distances. This geographic spread had made it difficult for law enforcement to see the connection. But with the matching chemical signature and nearly identical methods, they knew they were dealing with one person, a highly organized and meticulous killer. The prime suspect, Carl Nilsson, was suddenly viewed in a different light. His volatile past and connection to Ingrid made him an easy scapegoat, but there was no evidence tying him to the earlier murders. Forensic results from his belongings came back negative. The residue wasn't found anywhere on his property, and none of his items matched the ones used to bury or move Ingrid's body. Investigators reluctantly ruled him out as the killer, though they kept him under surveillance in case new evidence emerged. The realization that the killer might still be at large, free to strike again, set the town of Sundsvall on edge. Women were warned to avoid walking alone or taking remote paths, and the once peaceful community was gripped by fear. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their search for potential suspects. They combed through employment records and customer logs for companies that used the rare chemical found on Ingrid's clothing. The list was extensive, but one name stood out: Lars Svensson. Lars was a factory supervisor at a plant located just outside Sundsvall. The plant specialized in producing industrial-grade adhesives and solvents, one of which contained the exact compound found on Ingrid's clothing. Lars had worked at the plant for nearly 20 years, maintaining a quiet, uneventful life. His co-workers described him as reserved, almost invisible, someone who blended into the background. At first glance, Lars didn't seem like a likely suspect. He had no criminal record, no known connections to Ingrid, and no outward signs of aggression. But investigators couldn't ignore the circumstantial evidence piling up against him. They began looking deeper into his life, searching for any anomalies that might link him to the murders. When police obtained a warrant to search his home, they made a chilling discovery. In the basement of Lars's modest house, they found a hidden room filled with disturbing trophies. Photos, clothing, and personal items belonging to Ingrid and the other two victims were meticulously arranged, alongside maps marked with locations of their abductions. Lars Svensson, the quiet, unassuming factory worker, had been living a double life as a cold-blooded serial killer. The evidence was overwhelming, but the depths of his depravity would only come to light in the days to come. The facade of innocence had finally cracked, and a predator who had evaded justice for years was about to face the consequences. The arrest of Lars Svensson sent tremors of disbelief through Sundsvall. The quiet, inconspicuous factory supervisor, whom most of the town had considered harmless, was now revealed to be a calculated and ruthless murderer. The discovery of the hidden room in his basement was only the beginning of unraveling the truth. Investigators unearthed more chilling evidence during their search of his property: pieces of women's clothing and photographs dating back years, all carefully preserved in plastic bins. Each victim had been stalked, harassed, and observed before being abducted. He had meticulously planned and executed each murder, blending in with the background while quietly becoming a predator in his own town. In his home, Lars maintained a collection of disturbing items from his victims' personal effects, such as jewelry, books, and even locks of hair. It was evident that, for Lars, the act of murder was part of a twisted ritual. The trophies weren't just reminders of his crimes, they were his way of holding on to power and control, even after his victims were dead. The collection grew over time, with Ingrid's items added to the shelves as soon as he had secured his kill. The psychological profile of Lars painted a portrait of a man who lived in utter isolation, disconnected from emotional bonds or empathy. The motives behind his killings didn't stem from passion or desire, but from a deep-seated need to control, to dominate. Each victim represented something he could never possess in his own life. His relationships were shallow at best. His co-workers described him as someone who kept to himself, spoke little, and avoided social events. As police dug deeper into his past, they uncovered disturbing details that explained the root of his desire for control. Growing up in a violent household, Lars had been subject to constant abuse. His father, an alcoholic, was known to physically and verbally assault Lars and his mother. From a young age, Lars was conditioned to believe that control was the key to survival. By By the time he reached adulthood, he had learned how to hide his dark impulses under the surface, wearing a mask of normalcy in public while feeding his fantasies in private. Lars's victims hadn't been random, each one had been selected meticulously. Ingrid Wallstrom had been a particular obsession. She embodied qualities Lars both feared and despised: independence, kindness, and strength. She was everything he couldn't be. He watched her for months before making his move, carefully learning her habits and routines. The threats she received in the weeks before her death had been a way for him to assert his presence in her life, making her fear something she could not understand. After his arrest, Lars provided a chilling confession, detailing the calm precision with which he had carried out each murder. But it wasn't just the murders that disturbed investigators, it was his cold indifference. He showed no remorse, no empathy for the families he had torn apart. He claimed that he had never felt anything for his victims, that they were merely pieces in a game he had created to satisfy his twisted needs. The trial that followed was widely covered, drawing intense media attention. The residents of Sundsvall were stunned, unable to grasp how someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such horrific crimes. Lars Svensson was sentenced to life in prison, his name forever linked to the darkest chapter in Sundsvall's history. As the town slowly recovered from the trauma of the discovery, Ingrid Wallstrom's memory became a symbol of strength. Her family established a foundation in her name, working to raise awareness about the importance of personal safety and offering support to victims of violence. The community came together in remembrance of a life that was taken far too soon, yet whose legacy would continue to inspire long after the case had faded into the past. In a way, Ingrid had become the hero of a story she never got to tell. Her death had forced a town to confront its deepest fears, but in the end it was her spirit that shone through, giving light to a painful truth: evil can hide in plain sight, but it will never truly go unnoticed.